Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are analyzing a threat that's, well, completely invisible, but really pervasive. We're talking about the constant intake of air toxins and these persistent chemical compounds, stuff that's silently accumulating inside our bodies. Our mission here is to pull together a whole stack of pretty intense research. We're looking at urban air pollution, chemical off-gassing inside our homes, the, biological impact of forever chemicals, PFA, and we'll also look at an analysis of some new purification tech designed to maybe intercept these particles.
Oh.
We're really exploring this concept the sources kept bringing up, the toxin saturation point.
Yeah, and maybe the best way to grasp the urgency of the saturation idea is through an anecdote. Our sources detail this case. A woman diagnosed with severe late-stage liver cancer. Now, she didn't have any of the usual risk factors. No heavy drinking, no smoking, nothing like that. The breakthrough only came after a really deep environmental investigation. Turns out her body was just saturated with PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, and the main source, surprisingly, an old, really heavily scratched nonstick cooking pan, one she'd refused to throw away for decades. So this wasn't like a sudden poisoning event. It was long-term, chronic, totally invisible accumulation. And it finally hit that biological breaking point. That's the toxin saturation point right there.
Wow. That really shifts it, doesn't it? From some abstract environmental issue to like an immediate personal threat inside our own bodies. Okay, so let's break down where this buildup comes from. We're dealing with two main categories, right? Indoor and outdoor toxins. And the research says they often kind of combine, amplifying the risk. Let's start inside, the place we usually think is safe.
Yeah, you'd think so, but indoor air quality can be a real minefield. The sources really highlight that so much of what we bring into our homes is constantly off-gassing harmful chemicals.
You mean like TVOCs? Total volatile organic compounds. For anyone listening, that's the mix of gases from, well, thousands of products, right? Solvents in paints, sealants, glues in new furniture, even microplastics from car interiors or carpets, that kind of chemical soup of modern living.
Exactly. Formaldehyde, benzene, ammonia, they're all leaching out continuously.
And it's not just the building materials or furniture.
No, definitely not. Think about personal care. We're basically generating toxic molecules just getting ready in the morning. Artificial fragrances and perfumes, cosmetics, shampoos, even cleaning sprays release these volatile things that just hang in the air we breathe.
Okay, but what about things designed to clean the air? Air purifiers,
Okay.
AC systems.
Well, they can actually become part of the problem sometimes. Cheap or maybe poorly set up air purifiers, if they're too concentrated, can generate harmful ozone. And maybe more critically, central air conditioning systems. They get flagged a lot in the research. They can accumulate mold spores, other microtoxic particles, especially, when seasons change. And then they just efficiently blast that stuff right back into every single room.
Right, so the indoor environment is priming us. That really sets the stage for what's happening outside. The constant barrage from urban pollution, that sounds like much more aggressive particles.
Oh, it is. We're constantly breathing in the waste from combustion and just wear and tear. Exhaust from cars, trucks, especially diesel, motorbikes, planes too. Then there's brake dust, industrial microplastics. City construction, cement dust, road abrasion, all churning out huge amounts of particulate matter.
We hear a lot about PM 2.5.
We do, but the research we looked at really zeroes in on the most, let's say, lethal size. PM 0.1, just to give a sense of scale. PM 2.5 is like 30 times smaller than human hair. Tiny. But PM 0.1, that's way smaller still. It's closer in size to a common virus.
Wow, okay. That is a staggering difference. And that must change how the body even deals with them. But hang on, there's this really specific finding in the sources about biological carriers. It sounded kind of bizarre. Are they really saying plant pollen can carry pesticides?
Yeah, it sounds strange, but the evidence they cite is actually pretty compelling on that mechanism.
Essentially, yes.
Tiny particles of pesticide residue can attach to the surface of pollen grains as the pollen travels through agricultural areas or even just, city landscaping with pesticides. So when you breathe in that pollen thinking it's just allergies, you might also be inhaling microscopic insecticide along with it.
That just hammers home the reality of this toxic penetration, doesn't it? Which brings us back to the simple act of opening a window. You think fresh air. But the research basically says you're just opening the door for a 204/7 toxic invasion. So why are these ultrafine PM 0.1 particles so incredibly dangerous once they get inside?
Okay, this is really the core of why they drive that saturation and the long-term damage. It's their size. PM 0.1 and even smaller nanoparticles. They bypass almost all our body's natural defenses. Like the hairs in our nose, mucous membrane, they don't just get stuck in the lungs, they can actually penetrate the lung alveoli, the tiny air sacs. And from there, they get directly into the bloodstream. And once they're in the blood, they can travel basically anywhere. And the sources are very clear on this. These particles have been found reaching the brain. And, crucially, they can even penetrate the cell nucleus. Now, when a foreign chemical or particle gets inside the nucleus, that's where our DNA is. It has the potential to fundamentally change cell fate. It could alter genetic material, trigger cell dysfunction. They are, in a very real sense, capable of changing our biology from the inside out.
Okay, that sets us up perfectly for Section 2 then, forever poisons and the saturation effect. So, general air toxins mess with our cell structure, but PFAS, these actively drive the saturation because they just never leave. Let's go back to that nonstick pan case. Her high toxin load, it couldn't have been just from that one pan, surely.
Oh, absolutely not. That pan was just the most obvious source in a whole sea of invisible input. The sources really stress that PFAS exposure is multi-source. It's unavoidable, almost. It's coming from coatings on food packaging, sometimes drinking water, especially near industrial sites, waterproof fabrics, stain-resistant carpets, even some cosmetics. You're passively taking in these chemicals through countless little interactions every single day.
So why forever chemicals? What is it chemically that makes them so stubborn? Why can't the body just flush them out like other waste?
Well, what's really fascinating, chemically speaking, is the bond itself. PFAS compounds contain carbon-fluorine bonds, and that bond is like the strongest single bond known in organic chemistry. It's incredibly stable. Our human metabolism, the enzymes we have, just don't have the tools or, frankly, the energy needed to break that specific bond down.
So the body literally can't process them.
Exactly. That chemical shield means they can't be metabolized, they can't be broken down, they can't be excreted effectively. So they accumulate, they build up, they stay in the bloodstream, they get into vital organs, they get stored in fat tissue for years, decades potentially. This makes them a primary driver, maybe the primary engine, for chronic saturation. It's a constantly rising internal burden.
And once that burden gets high enough, once these chemicals are sort of fused with bodily fluids hiding inside cells, what are the actual biological consequences the research points to?
The consequences are pretty severe, mainly because they're cumulative. They build over time. First, functional disorders and actual organ degradation. We're talking irreversible damage, even tissue death eventually. Second, there's major immune disruption. The constant presence of these foreign chemicals basically forces the immune system into this state of chronic, low-level inflammation. And that dramatically increases the risk for various cancers, autoimmune conditions, things like that.
So it's not just one point of failure, it's stressing the whole system.
Exactly. And we also see clear links to neurological damage, things like cognitive decline, loss of focus, but basically the brain struggling under this constant toxic load. And here's a really key point from the research. The organ that eventually fails seems almost random. It's unpredictable. The toxins basically seek out your weakest link. Could be genetic, could be from other environmental stresses. So for one person, it might be the liver, another the kidneys, someone else, the brain. It depends entirely on your personal genetics and how fast these things accumulate in your body.
It really does sound like a metabolic ticking time bomb, like the source said. But surely, before catastrophic organ failure, the body sends out warning signs, distress signals. We're talking to a savvy audience here, so let's get beyond just feeling tired. What are these signals, and what's the mechanism behind them, according to the sources?
Well, the sources explain it like this. The body's detox pathways, mainly the liver, are working constantly over time, trying to neutralize this endless influx. So those persistent signs, poor sleep, chronic pain, that constant brain fog, they aren't just getting older. The research suggests it's metabolic disruption. The body is burning huge amounts of energy, nonstop, just trying to neutralize and maybe wall off this accumulated toxin load. That leads directly to that debilitating fatigue. Your body is just plain exhausted from fighting this continuous chemical battle.
Okay, and that leads to a really interesting critique within the source material about mainstream medicine. If the symptoms are kind of vague fatigue, brain fog, and the root cause is invisible toxic input, how does medicine usually handle that?
Yeah, this is a major point in the research we reviewed. They talk about a diagnostic blind spot in mainstream medicine. Doctors are trained, rightly so, to diagnose and treat the disease, the symptom, the endpoint, the organ failure. But they rarely have the time or maybe the framework to investigate the root origin, especially when it's chronic, low-level toxic exposure building up over decades.
Like in the liver cancer case.
Exactly. That investigation only happened because one specific doctor took that extra, unusual step to look into her environmental history. The conclusion here is that this constant, invisible toxic input is very often missed, which means effectively you only get treated after the saturation point has been violently passed. Too late, really.
So the challenge is stark. An environment pushing toxins in, a biology that can't get them out, and a diagnostic system that often overlooks the input until it's critical.
Okay, let's pivot then. Let's look at prevention. Why have traditional air filters struggled so much to break this cycle?
Right. The filtration challenge boils down almost entirely to those PM 0.1 and smaller nanoparticles. Traditional HEPA filters, the standard ones, are defined by their effectiveness against particles 0.3 micrometers and larger. That's their job. But that means the most dangerous toxins, the ones small enough to get into the bloodstream and brain. They pretty much sail right through conventional HEPA.
So size is the main issue. Are there other reasons standard filters fail against these? Yeah, beyond just the size barrier, it's also about kinetics and chemistry. First, the airflow in conventional systems needs to be pretty fast to move enough air, but that speed often means there isn't enough dwell time for chemical absorption to really work on gases and VOCs. Second, a lot of filters use electrostatic effects to help grab smaller particles. But the source material we looked at indicates these electrostatic charges can decay quite quickly, sometimes within weeks. After that, the filter loses much of its effectiveness against those crucial ultrafine toxins.
Okay, this brings us neatly to Section 4, where the sources analyze a potential solution. We're looking at research around this specific device, the Air 6-free maze purifier. Its mandate is apparently to be a toxin terminator. Now, claiming a 6-free, standard dust-free, germ-free, toxin-free, smoke-free, odor-free, and heavy metal-free, that's my ability, well, that's an incredible claim, especially against complex stuff like TDOCs and PMEO 1.1. What does the analysis actually say about its viability? Is there independent data cited in the sources confirming it can actually achieve toxin-free and heavy metal-free?
And that skepticism is totally warranted. The analysis provided in the sources does acknowledge that this is a very high bar, especially, like you said, for removing true nanotoxins in heavy metals, which are notoriously difficult. They kind of frame the technology more as a necessary evolution in thinking. The focus of the material we saw was less on, say, independent long-term verification studies, which would take years, and more on explaining the mechanism that's designed specifically to overcome those HEPA failure points we just discussed.
Okay, so what is the mechanism? How does it supposedly work?
The core idea is this 5-step maze principle. Step 1 uses negative ion charging combined with a HEPA pre-filter that handles the bigger standard stuff, dust, pollen, some VOCs. Step 2 involves a secondary ionization phase. The claim here is that this neutralizes pathogens like bacteria and viruses, and also helps break down chemical toxins molecularly.
Right, so pre-filtering and then a kind of chemical attack. But the real challenge is physically grabbing those tiny PM0.1 particles, right? How did the maze part do that?
Yes, this is the critical bit, the differentiating mechanism described in the research. Steps 3 and 4 are all about this. The air enters a special electrostatic maze box. This is designed for permanent capture, not just temporary filtering. Instead of just pushing air straight through a filter medium, it forces the air through a series of really sharp turns and constrictions within this maze structure.
Ah, so it's not just filtering, it's forcing collisions.
Exactly. They call it the maze effect. The idea is that the velocity and the sharp changes in direction cause the ultrafine nanoparticles, because of their inertia, to basically crash into the charged surfaces of the maze. They simply can't make those sharp turns at speed, so they impact the walls and get trapped permanently.
So it's using physics, inertial impaction, rather than just relying on the filter mesh size to stop them.
Precisely. And then step 5 is just the release of what they claim is ultra-clean, toxin-free air. The application, or the implication, is what makes the claim so potent.
Mm-hmm.
If this mechanism actually works as described, it could theoretically stop that constant toxic input. It stops the user from being, as the sources vividly put it, a human air filter.
That phrase, human air filter, really does crystallize the whole problem, doesn't it? It brings us right back full circle to this idea of the saturation point.
It really does. If we tie all this together, the synthesized knowledge from these sources seems pretty clear. Constant toxic input leads to gradual, often invisible accumulation over decades. Then suddenly, unpredictably, an organ fails when that personal saturation point is finally breached. And according to this research, the only truly viable path to preventing that endpoint is to aggressively stop the chronic toxic input in the first place.
So here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. Everyone on this planet, basically, will inhale or consume these multi-source toxins. It's just part of modern life now. Once they get inside your body, they will start to accumulate, and they will, according to this research, seek out your weakest organ system, and they'll just wait there, building up until that saturation point is reached. So the question for you is, knowing that this accumulation is happening, invisibly, relentlessly, are you actively doing anything to manage your toxic input? Or are you just sort of passively waiting, hoping your saturation point doesn't silently arrive?